Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of This Week in Global Development. My name is Rumbi Chakamba, and I'll be your host this week. And I'm joined by our managing editor, Anna Gawel, as well as our senior reporter, Colum Lynch, to discuss the topics of the day. And our reporters are still on the story of USAID's dismantling this week. Starting towards the end of last week, we began to see legal challenges to the dismantling of USAID. The first coming from two unions that were representing USAID employees. Then we saw two smaller NGOs also coming together to mount a legal challenge. And then finally, because I thought this was going to come a little bit earlier, we saw a legal challenge from a group of partners that have partnered with USAID, including the big partners, which are Chemonics and DAI. So Anna, I'm going to start with you. Can you take us through some of the legal challenges and what these companies have laid out, what these companies and employees have laid out?
Sure. To start with, it was an anxious period. I think people were really waiting these few weeks that felt like months to have these legal challenges start trickling in. As you mentioned, the first one was filed by two unions on behalf of USAID employees specifically. And this, what it did was it blocked the 2,200 employees from being put on administrative leave, reinstated 500, reinstated access to systems, and also blocked an order that would have recalled thousands more USAID employees stationed abroad. I think it's critical to note that with this first lawsuit, it does not address the general funding freeze that we're seeing on U.S. foreign aid. It also does not address the private contractor side. It's strictly USAID direct hires and the impact that it's had on them. Like you mentioned, the more recent lawsuit is quite significant because that one has pulled in the for-profit large contractors in addition to some NGOs and INGOs. And that's significant because for a while they had been waiting on the sidelines, kind of, I think, potentially fearing repercussions from the Trump administration, jeopardizing future current contracts. But it really reached a financial breaking point. I think you had mentioned Chemonics. They're owed something like $100 million for work they did in 2024. They've been forced to lay off nearly 2/3 of their staff, or furlough, I should say. So this one is, some people are speculating, the critical one that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. I think what's key to point out is that the judicial process in the United States is quite lengthy. So getting to the Supreme Court is going to be quite a while. And the question is, who will be left? The small NGOs are barely surviving the current 90-day pause for a review period. Some have already been going under. And now we're seeing these larger partners like Chemonics, DAI, as you said, Catholic Relief Services, who are also struggling financially because they're not being paid for work that was already done. So again, these lawsuits are incredibly critical to both the private sector, the private contractors, the direct hire staff, and really the future of these large implementers.
Yeah, speaking of the lengthy process, the restraining order that the unions managed to get for the employees actually expires this Friday at 11:59. So that's going to be a key moment to see what happens, because they've sort of paused the administrative leave for them for a week, is it? But we need to find out what happens next, which is going to be really important. And talking about the sidelines, which is why I was so interested in the last lawsuit that you speak about, which involves Chemonics, DAI. DAI is owed $103 million, and Chemonics is owed $103 million, and DAI is owed $120 million, and that's from last year, and not talking about work for this year. So I think there was a point in time where people were in a phase of, can we make this work? Is there any way we can stay under the radar and continue to work with the Trump administration? And they've come to a breaking point. And I think we still have some organizations, UN organizations, that are trying to make it work. Colum, you published a story last week that spoke about the IOM and how they are sort of changing their website and taking out references to progressive programs, thinking of things like DEI, and they're talking and removing references to sexual reproductive health and gender issues on their website. And I think that's probably a bid to be more in line with like the Trump administration's America First agenda. Can you tell us a little bit more about what they're doing?
I think there is a general panic across the sector, which is not surprising. We've seen organizations like the UN Population Fund, which anticipated having its funds cut. But what they didn't anticipate was that it would be for already approved, appropriated funds. So that, as you kind of mentioned, is the thing I think that really caught people off guard and has really kind of sown kind of chaos and panic throughout the industry. A lot of the agencies, most of them are trying to keep their heads down a little bit. They don't want to be targeted by the administration. They have a reputation for retribution. So you have big American-led organizations like UNICEF, WFP, IOM, which are trying to navigate this. I think that the International Organization for Migration has probably been at the most forward-leaning in trying to signal to the Trump administration that the work they do is consistent with American interests and American values. One of the areas where they really got hit initially was on the refugee resettlement, refugee admissions program in the United States. Under the Biden administration, they allowed 100,000 refugees, all people who had been vetted, who went through legal immigration, into the country in 2024. The Biden administration had proposed 125,000 this year. Unsurprisingly, the Trump administration stopped that, and they want to kill that program off entirely. It's a program that involves about 5,000 workers for IOM, so a pretty big chunk of their 20,000 employees. And last week, 3,000 employees received letters basically indicating that they're going to be let go. So I think that one of the things that IOM has done is like they've gone into their website and they've tried to strip out anything that is potentially going to provoke the administration. They had a program that had been there for years, fighting sexual exploitation. It was started under the instigation of William Swing, a former American head of IOM. They basically dismantled that because it's a program that shows it's getting funding from the State Department. So I think they try in a quite dramatic way that maybe has backfired on them, but in a quite dramatic way to try to lessen the opportunity for them to be targeted. You have even, like organizations like UNICEF and WFP, which, people like Elise Stefanik, the new U.S. ambassador to the UN, have praised those organizations carrying out work that serves American interests. They're also facing a lot of challenges. They're affected by the work stoppages. The U.S. mission to the UN recently had a meeting of the UNICEF Executive Board and basically for the first time opposed consensus on the adoption of basic work programs for several countries, Haiti, Colombia, Somalia, on the grounds that there was too much DEI language, too much what they call gender ideology language. So they're taking a hard line even with the institutions that they have generally applauded. So it's a very uncertain, very difficult, very traumatic sort of moment for all of them.
A very uncertain time for the organizations and all trying to figure out how to navigate this. But I'm wondering how long it can last, because I think the UN is set up as a diverse entity. It is, and diversity has been such a huge part of what it is that they do. And when you, as you mentioned in the UNICEF story, a lot of the partner countries that support DEI and gender have always had the backing of the United States. And this was something that the Biden administration would actually push. And I think it would be very difficult to get a consensus on removing such language going into the future. Do you think that would be the case?
Well, I mean, look, in the UNICEF discussion, there was already pushback. I mean, the Americans were opposed 31-1 in the adoption of these work plans. 24 countries delivered a statement. It was delivered by Germany on behalf of 24 countries, basically underscoring the importance of those programs. I think one of the things that is kind of interesting is like, what does DEI even mean? So it's three words: diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, these are kind of phrases that are kind of written into the DNA of the United Nations. Is diversity inherently a bad thing? And I think that that's one of the problems, is a lot of the concerns that the Americans have, they're quite vague, and, they have an interpretation of any of those words being used is kind of suspect. I mean, IOM was just removing words like inclusion from, which had nothing to do with any DEI initiatives, but just words like inclusion were just, taken out of, were scrubbed from the website, because they might be perceived by the administration as reflecting, the kind of DEI movement in the United States. So there's going to be pushback, but the Americans have enormous financial leverage. I mean, they can break the system if they want to. And so, people may have to make compromises that they normally wouldn't make.
100%. I think this is a moment where the whole world is acknowledging just how much influence the Americans have on foreign aid and foreign assistance going forward. But one interesting conversation that I absolutely enjoyed, maybe because I've been looking for hope in this whole scenario, hope for our community somehow, was the conversation that our editor-in-chief Raj had with Jim Richardson, who used to head FBUR during the first Trump administration. And the big question was, is this the end of USAID? And one of his answers was, we will see foreign assistance going forward. And he sort of talked about a moment where we kind of now have like thoughtful policy and think of how can we make foreign assistance work for this administration. And he's speaking of a time when that will come, probably past all the lawsuits. Can you tell us a little bit more about his analysis of this moment, Anna?
Sure. Yeah, I think that was a great point that he raised, which is the courts need to weigh in. And then I think the other really main important point that he made was that Congress has not really weighed in just yet. We're starting to see, there's obviously been pushback from Democrats, and there's been a lot of speeches. The hearings have begun. We've seen a resolution introduced by Sarah Jacobs. But I can't stress enough that the Democrats are the minority power in both houses of Congress. And obviously they don't control the White House. You used to have a sense of bipartisanship when it came to budget cuts to foreign aid. This is something Jim Richardson talked about as well. And that bipartisanship prevented a lot of the steeper cuts that the Trump administration wanted in its first term. But that kind of support has been eroded. Donald Trump has a very firm control of this party, including moderates, much more so, many people say, than his first administration. So there's less pushback. And Republicans, to be fair, have for years been warning about or, disagreeing with the fact of this gets to what Colum was talking about in terms of DEI and gender ideology, from what they call progressive ideological programs and agenda, such as LGBTQ rights, DEI, climate change, etc. So, the sympathies this current round may be limited. Some Republicans have voiced quietly opposition to not, as one put, like throw the baby out with the bathwater, so that, not get rid of all foreign aid. It serves a purpose. But I think the most interesting thing, and in terms of Congress and Congress weighing in, will be on March 14th is the deadline for the current federal spending to expire. So there's going to be a lot of talks ramped up and negotiations. And I think something for this whole community to keep an eye out is, how much will Democrats fight for foreign aid and risk a potential government shutdown? they're certainly going to fight for policies that they disagree with in terms of Republicans, but will aid be included in that? There was, I forget who it was that said, foreign aid is not a priority among domestic constituents, among the American voters. They consistently misstate how much is actually spent on foreign aid and think it's much higher. So these are voters, these are the constituents. And I think the big question is, are Democrats, is foreign aid the hill they're willing to die on come March 14th in these negotiations? So that's something that is really critical that I think we all should be watching.
That's a big question and something that I've been digging into as a non-American, trying to figure out how is this possible and do people actually care about foreign aid? And the analysis that I'm seeing is it's not that important domestically, and it might be used as a case study because it's not so important. It could be the first thing that they sort of like bring the Department of Government Efficiency on and they tackle foreign aid, but it might be that there's a department that's coming after this. And once that impacts something that people care about, let's say maybe perhaps education, maybe we'll start to see more protests around this. Do you think that's what we're going to see? And will it be too late for foreign aid at that point in time?
That's really a key question. And I agree. That's what many people are pointing out, is that USAID is kind of a test case that can fly under the radar. Certainly, Education Department is in the crosshairs of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. There's talk of Medicaid cuts being next in line. I do think that's when you start to see these bread and butter issues touching on everyday lives. Primarily, I think more so when you get to like these cuts in domestic assistance, that you're going to see pushback, especially including from Republicans whose, again, their constituents are concerned when it hits their pocketbooks. So I do think so. I think a big question is you'll see more lawsuits, and you'll see much more congressional pushback. Again, will foreign aid be incorporated into this larger movement? That really remains to be seen.
Yeah, I sort of wonder, I mean, part of this is, all of this discussion, debate, and all this action to sort of, dismantle USAID, just Congress has been absent from this whole picture. And you have had Elon Musk has been in the ascendancy, and I think that he doesn't really weigh, kind of the interest of a lot of the political constituencies of key Republican and Democratic groups and leaders. And so, groups like, the faith-based groups, conservative and progressive, Christian, Jewish organizations that provide aid, a lot of the thinking, sort of for instance, in the Project 2025 program, were focused on trying to shift resources from a lot of the kind of, corporate, deliverers of aid to faith-based organizations. But the faith-based organizations have been getting hit as hard as anybody else. They just don't have a voice in this discussion, and they have enormous influence in the party, but that has not transferred into real influence in this discussion. And I think that goes to the point of how swift this process has had, and also, the fact that, I think, Elon Musk North Star on this is basically just, reducing the size of the federal budget, right? And dismantling some of the agencies, and less concerned about, who's getting hurt and who isn't getting hurt. And so that'll change, but, when it does change, a lot of the damage will already have been done, and it'll be hard to sort of, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story. I think you worked on this last week, Colum, that was basically saying that things are changing and we can never go back to what it was. And it reminds me of so many conversations that we've had with like health experts that talk about how long it took to build these networks that they're breaking down in a matter of weeks. And it includes trust, it includes like physical networks, it includes all these organizations that are probably going to go under. And it only took a couple of weeks for them to be able to break those networks down, and rebuilding them will probably be impossible or not happen. What are your thoughts, Anna?
No, I absolutely agree. It's such a complicated process. To me, to echo your point, what it makes me think of is the waiver process, the current waiver process. And it's been very vague. And the few waivers that have been granted, it again goes to your point of the entire ecosystem, supply chain, the nurses who deliver treatments for HIV/AIDS. Are they included in the waivers? Will they be paid? And that is very vague at the moment. So, and that's assuming you even get a waiver, because as you know, thousands are applying for them to be exempt from this foreign aid freeze. But with so many employees out at USAID, there's no one to really process these waivers. But again, even if you have them, our colleague Sarah Jerving had a report in terms of a Christian NGO in Kenya recently, where they got a waiver related to the PEPFAR HIV/AIDS program. But, on the ground, it didn't really matter much because the payment system is frozen. So even the organizations who get these waivers are unable to draw down money. And even if the money starts flowing, you're talking about a matter of time, and you're talking about a very complex ecosystem that, again, like you said, has been built up over years and years. And there's so many stakeholders who actually will get paid once that payment system is unblocked is a huge question.
A huge question. And that story that you're talking about, Sarah's story, I found that extremely interesting because this is a much smaller organization based in Kenya. And USAID had negotiated an agreement with them where they advance payments to them so that they're able to do work. 2 days before the waiver hit, they had processed their advance for January, but it hadn't been paid down, that the payment system shut down. So irregardless of the waiver, they can't do any work because they do not have the money. They were expecting an advance from USAID, and they're not a big contractor like, let's say, Chemonics that could potentially go ahead, but there's so much confusion. There's no way for them to communicate with USAID. So it's basically shut down whether or not there's a waiver. And I think we're going to begin seeing more cases and stories of like recipients of the aids now actually being affected, because right now I think the conversation is a lot on the companies and the staff members that are affected, but soon we're going to see recipients of the aid also being affected because it means they cannot deliver the goods that they were supposed to do. But in the next week or so, what should we be on the lookout for? I know we've got all these lawsuits that are happening. Is there anything in particular that we should be on the lookout for? And do these lawsuits actually slow down the dismantling? We've had a 1-week reprieve for employees at USAID. Does it actually slow anything down?
Yeah, I get the sense that the real question is, will law be made as a result of these challenges? Does this go to the Supreme Court? And I think those will be really absolutely essential, important decisions on the separation of powers, on the authority of Congress, on the authority of the president to do whatever he wants, including make decisions on the finances of the country, which, has generally been under the purview of Congress. So I think there's going to be some really momentous decisions going forward on the extent of presidential power, and it'll be a test of the rest of the next 4 years with President Trump.
Yeah, I think on that note, it'll be interesting to see over the next few weeks if Congress, specifically Republicans, start fighting for their so-called power of the purse, where they control the appropriations process, the money process. And this gets, specifically to USAID. They've earmarked projects. Will there finally be pushback ahead of, again, the March 14th deadline? Because they're ceding some of their powers in terms of funding programs. I think in terms of the lawsuits, we may see more kind of temporary reprieves, more than a week to iron out some of these issues. The government didn't come in with a complete set of arguments this last time around. So, I think that there might be some more postponing and, keeping people on administrative leave, but restoring their access to systems and things along those lines in the immediate term. But again, in the long term, you're looking at none of the lawsuits have addressed the waivers or the general freeze. And I think the big thing we'll all be looking at down the line is the end of this 90-day review by the State Department. And what comes of it? Will it be extended? That's a key question. What, will ultimately pass the review and what will not?
Yeah, someone to watch out for too is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, probably the most articulate defender of foreign aid in the GOP, who has been, I don't know what role he played in sort of the decision-making, but, there's the appearance that he's not really the key player on this, that he is not making the decisions. He has been kind of doing some damage control, issuing waivers that, they haven't really been able to sort of make work very efficiently. But does he, will he try to sort of leave his stamp on whatever kind of USAID comes out of this, whether it's within the State Department or whether, there are some requirements that, that USAID have, be forced to open up its doors. And others like Lindsey Graham, a long-term champion of foreign assistance, basically, played a major role in blocking efforts by the first Trump administration to sort of to impose massive cuts on foreign aid, blocked those at the time, but doesn't seem to be kind of in the mood for playing that role this time, doesn't seem to have the power, the authority to do it. So I think, to watch, like, Anna says, to watch kind of some of the key players in the Republican Party, people who traditionally believe in this stuff. And also, what about, evangelical Christians? What about other powerful, constituencies of, the MAGA movement of the Trump administration? Are they going to have a say? And will they find a way to, to have influence on this process?
That's definitely a lot to look out for. I was actually going to mention, Anna, that 90 days doesn't seem like a lot of time to conduct a thorough review of projects. I think initially when we heard 90 days, we thought it might be rooting out certain projects that are progressive in nature, but 90 days doesn't seem like enough time to conduct this thorough review. So waiting to see if that is extended as well. And I also think the big question right now for our community in particular is, how do I operate in this space? And if you're looking for such answers, I think a really great avenue to get them is our pro briefings. If you haven't signed up for a pro subscription, I encourage you to do that. Our editor-in-chief, Raj Kumar, is having pro briefings, I think on a weekly basis now, and he's calling in experts who are able to explain this moment as well as give advice on how to navigate this scenario. Any additions to that, Anna, Gawel, in terms of our pro briefings before we wrap this up?
Yeah, we're going by the news in terms of, hosting them. So every time there's a new development, we're, like you said, trying to bring in new experts. And I think the key is we've been bringing in legal experts because the intricacies of the law are so complex. And this is really something, again, people are turning to the courts for relief. And we've been trying to bring in Republicans as well to get their perspective. We know a lot of Democrats are for USAID and are trying to salvage it. But there's certainly the perspective of the other side, which again is the majority party in Congress.
And for me, the Republican briefings have been most helpful to me because I think having an understanding of the thought process behind it, behind the change, is actually really helpful. And I think that's also been helpful for people who are actually just trying to navigate this space and time. Any last words from you, Colum, before we end this episode?
No, I mean, well, one thing I always sort of wonder is we always look for a certain rationale. So there are plenty of people in the Republican, administration who will present what's happening as a sort of well thought out process. But in practice, you sort of wonder. It's like, a broken clock can be right, 2 times during the day, right? And so you feel like you wonder whether are you assigning a certain kind of rationale and logic to what's happening, or is kind of this destructive kind of impulse, is that what is really driving it, and that that there isn't really a lot of thought going into how to transform this into a more effective process to improve people's lives, to do other things to advance American security, and how much of it is a kind of effort to retaliate against people perceived as not politically aligned with you. So I'll leave it at that.
I think people who are on the ground would probably agree with you that it seems chaotic. The process seems chaotic at the moment. We're hoping it gets better, but our reporters are on the story and we'll be giving you each update as we get it and trying to explain whatever it is we're able to. Thank you so much for joining us once again for this week's episode of This Week in Global Development. Please join us again next week where we'll have more updates on this story and others.
Thanks, Ruby.
Thank you.